As negotiations stall, how long can the world hold out? The U.S.-Israeli war on Iran continues, with a naval blockade on the Strait of Hormuz amplifying agony around the world. The cost of living is climbing while potentially millions of jobs are lost, and a ceasefire extension only seems to increase the uncertainty. So has a Pandora's box been opened in the Middle East? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. From the richest countries in the world to the poorest, all are taking a hit from the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. And the consequences aren't just economic, they're also political. With many expecting the Iranian regime to survive at any cost, the forecast, according to some, isn't quite the same for Washington and Israel. In fact, some analysts have gone as far as to say Iran's goal now is to end the Trump presidency with Israel's collateral damage. Here's a look now at how the economic and political landscape could change over the war on Iran.
A fragile ceasefire is holding on paper, but at sea, the confrontation is intensifying, and the fallout is spreading far beyond the battlefield. Iran has seized vessels and opened fire in the Strait of Hormuz, refusing to reopen the waterway while a US naval blockade remains in place. Washington says the pressure is working. Tehran says it will not negotiate under threat.
The president has not set a deadline himself. Ultimately, he will dictate the timetable. And again, he is satisfied with the naval blockade, and he understands that Iran is in a very weak position, and the cards are in President Trump's hands right now.
But the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to define what success looks like. With no compromise in sight on nuclear ambitions or control of the Strait of Hormuz, some analysts say Tehran gains more by dragging this out rather than ending it quickly. And that shifts the pressure not just onto Washington, but onto Israel as well. Because the longer the war lasts, the wider the fallout becomes, politically and economically, reaching far beyond the battlefield. The comparison with Iraq is being made again. But this time, the concern is not how the war starts, but what it leaves behind. Then, the consequences reshaped the region over years. Now, the disruption is already global. And the uncertainty is not just about how this war unfolds, but also about what it is meant to achieve.
He hasn't described what the goals of this war is. What does victory look like? If you can't describe victory, it means that you're going to keep searching until you, quote unquote, find it. That could take forever, that could be short. The other problem is that we don't know what the end result is in the region. We may be out of a war, in the shooting war, but we may have destabilized the region that's going to be getting us more involved in the future.
That may be the calculation in Washington, but Iran has spent decades adapting to sanctions and surviving under pressure, raising a different question about who can hold out longer. Beyond Washington and Israel, the consequences are already visible across the Gulf. Nearly 83% of Iran's missile and drone strikes have been directed at Gulf states, with the UAE the most targeted. For economies built on stability and investment, that stuff carries real cost. Gulf states remain reliant on US protection, even as this war makes them more exposed. And from there, the impact spreads outward. Countries like Pakistan, India, and the Philippines are already feeling the strain, with millions of their citizens working in the Gulf and sending money home. For India alone, remittance losses could reach between $5 and $10 billion if the war continues. This war is no longer just about Iran. It is a test of power, in Washington, across the Gulf, and beyond. If it continues on its current path, the question may not be who wins, but who comes out weaker.
So while nothing very worthy of headlines is happening in negotiations to end the war, the damage, both economic and political, continues to unfold. Joining me now to debate what's happening are, from Isfahan, Assistant Professor at the University of Tehran, Setareh Sadeqi. From Cairo, Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies, Dr. A Hellyer. And from London, Iranian-Canadian blogger and media researcher Hossein Derakhshan. Thank you all so much for being with me. So the U.S. says its blockade is about pressuring Iran into giving in. Iran says it will not negotiate under pressure like this. So it truly is a stalemate. Dr. Hellyer, how dangerous is this stalemate for all of us? And can anything force progress?
Thank you very much for having me on the program. No, I think it is quite dangerous because the gap between the two sides is incredibly large, which means that at some point somebody's going to have to escalate in one way or another. I don't think that we're going to see an easy resolution in the short term. I think that there's an appetite in Washington to find some sort of resolution, but the parameters that they've set in order to get there are really so different than what the Iranian regime would want as well, that I think it's quite unlikely. And if escalation does take place, then we're likely not to be simply talking about the Strait of Hormuz, but also the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula. And the economic fallout becomes that much more difficult to unravel.
It's interesting. I mean, yes, the gap between the two sides is huge, just about between the U.S. and Iran, but many would argue the gap between all sides is considerable. I mean, yesterday we spoke about the gap between different Gulf states and what they would like to see as the outcome here. Meanwhile, Hossein, we have the UK and French defense ministers saying that they're very confident progress can be made on the Strait of Hormuz. How is that? What would they be looking at? Are they hoping to bypass the U.S. somehow, or are they just feeling obligated to give some sort of optimism in the midst of all this?
I think the split between Europe and the US is very visible now. Obviously, this has been rising, and I think the split is very, very deep now. And the way it manifests itself when it comes to Iran is the emphasis on using diplomatic and non-military methods to get their ships in and out of the Persian Gulf through the Hormuz Strait. And I think what practically it means is that they are ready to pay what Iran is charging them. Obviously, Iran is also doing this within international law, because I'm not a lawyer, but it's a legal expert. But this is a matter of debate now with how this is possible, given the open sea rights and all those other international regulations about sea trade. But Iran is trying to stick to that, yet charge shipments in other terms, such as providing services for security or for environmental charges. So I think practically Europe is accepted the new the status quo.
It's interesting you think that the gap between the U.S. and Europe is widening. I mean, Dr. Hellyer, it looks like you disagree with that. But before we had spoken about how Europe has gone ahead to bypass the United States. They had negotiated their own deals with Iran, and a couple, arguably more than a couple, but the ships were getting through. I'm sure Setareh can tell us a little bit more. France got one of their fertilizer ships through because they paid the toll. So, I mean, just to confirm, Hossein, is that what you're thinking might be the strategy going forward, and overall seeing more kind of European partners distance themselves from what the U.S. would want them to do?
I think so, that at least for the short term, and given that Trump still hasn't given up on the Greenland, and I think he's also flirting with the idea of Cuban invasion, I think he's allowing himself to get out of Iran with the excuse of Cuba, but also Europeans are also concerned with Greenland as well.
Interesting. Okay, Dr. Hellyer, very quickly respond to why you don't think that's what's happening.
So, as you mentioned, the UK, France, and other countries are preparing to try to go into the Strait of Hormuz. So that's one aspect that I think needs to be put in here. If they were accepting the situation, then I don't think that would be happening. I don't think that international law permits the taking over of the Strait in this fashion. And it wouldn't simply be an Iranian strait, right? I mean, if you're talking about completely restricting or regulating traffic through the strait, even if you were to accept that the Iranians had the right to do so, which I don't think far and broadly speaking, people don't, with the exception, of course, of Iran. You'd also have to have the cooperation and the participation of the Omanis on the other side, and the Omanis have rejected that. So
then on what
I don't
basis
think
are
that
they
we can say that
expressing
because
this
the Iranians.
confidence? Why are these EU ministers expressing this confidence then?
I think that's a very good question. I think that's a good question to ask the Iranian regime, because they're doing this unilaterally. They're doing this against the expressed desires of not simply the international community, but all of their neighbors in the Gulf itself.
Fair enough. Setareh, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, Iran is acting totally based on international law, and the only parties that have violated international law are the Zionist regime and the U.S. regime that launched this illegal war against Iran based on United Nations law of the sea, which Iran actually is not a full party to, and the U.S. is not a full party to. Even within those laws, when a country comes under attack and its territorial waters become the battlefield, it has the right to regulate it. Also based on it's not international water. Based on international water sets a certain distance between the space and to consider them the territorial water of a country, and that is a territorial water of Iran and Oman based on international law. The Strait is international, but again, based on 1958 Geneva Convention, if a country is threatened and comes under attack, they have the right to regulate it and even charge a toll. And Iran is doing everything it's practicing and exercising as it's using its leverage over the Strait of Hormuz as a form of exercising its right to self-defense. The Strait of Hormuz was totally open before this war started. Iran was not charging any ship, but when the war started and Iran had warned, and it's a big mistake from the U.S. regime that they did not expect that Iran would start using its leverage over the Strait of Hormuz. And many politicians within the U.S. regime had also warned Trump administration that this would be a possible scenario. And now that Iran is exercising its right to self-defense and regulating the strait in order to, one, reverse the sanctions. Iran has been target of U.S. regime's economic terrorism, and this is the way Iran is responding to those sanctions. And second, as I said, this is an act of self-defense. And Iran opened the Strait of Hormuz during the ceasefire, but once they did not lift the blockade, the U.S. did not lift the blockade and continued imposing the blockade, violating the ceasefire, Iran imposed the restrictions again.
Okay, Dr. Hellyer, I can see you disagree, but Hossein, let me come to you, because we're seeing how both legally and diplomatically, there's still such a lack of clarity as to what rights are there and who really feels entitled, rightly so, to do what. But I need to ask you this, Hossein, because between just the United States and Iran, who do you think can really hold out the longest, especially economically? The United States might have more money, but Iran has more experience surviving some of the heaviest sanctions in the world, and its government has also survived the pressure of massive protests before. So who do you see? They both say neither party really holds the cards, but where do you see it?
I think when you look at the goals of either side, you realize that Iran has achieved its goal so far, which is survival. But on top of that, Iran has also introduced a new weapon of mass disruption, in addition to the capability of, well, to produce the weapon of mass destruction, which is the nuclear program. Now we have Hormuz Strait as a new deterrent asset, which is probably even more effective than the nuclear capability. And on the other side, the US has not achieved any of its goals of regime change, or getting the nuclear stockpile out, or even getting Iran to agree to zero enrichment, or even opening the Hormuz Strait to free shipping, and maybe even its plans to somehow destabilize Iran through ethnic minorities and arming some ethnic minorities around Iran and getting them inside Iran. None of these goals have been achieved. So now, if this ends now here, it's very obvious who has won.
Okay, Dr. Hellyer, let me ask you this. President Trump is back to saying that the goal is to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But since the United States and Israel have really thrown international law and adherence to multilateral institutions out the window, how would any agreement, even involving Iran's nuclear program, be enforced anyway and really taken seriously?
Thank you. I mean, just to briefly go back to the issue about international waters, your guest admitted these are international waters. You don't carry out self-defense by applying leverage on the international community in order to hit back against the United States. And I agree with what you've just said, that the U.S. threw international law out of the window, not simply in beginning this war on Iran, but in other ways as well, and also not just under the Trump administration. But that doesn't obviate the point around international law still applying to international waters, which Iran is not respecting in this regard. With regards to your specific question, I think that the Trump administration is in a very peculiar position of wanting to go back to something that looks like the JCPOA without calling it the JCPOA, and probably with more inferior terms than the JCPOA. But without, again, admitting as such, this war was not simply carried out, or begun rather, without due reference to international law. But I don't think it was a very strategic decision either. I mean, if you wanted to argue, yes, it's against international law, but the ends justify the means sort of thing. But there's nothing here that actually works. This strategically was a very poorly thought out strategy. I think that the strategy was based, frankly, on a fundamental misassessment of what the Iranian regime actually is. It's not going to capitulate as a result of some sort of shock and awe campaign. It's not Venezuela. It wasn't going to be simply decapitated and then fold. And any expert on Iranian affairs, of which there are many actually in Washington, would have told the administration this, but they clearly weren't listening.
Yeah, you talk about inferior terms as far as the nuclear program is concerned. What's on the table now is a proposal of a 5-year suspension of the nuclear program, when the JCPOA actually had 10, and that was renewable as well. So let me come back to Setareh, though, because one of the main questions we kind of opened this program with was whether Iran sees a political opportunity now to destroy Trump's presidency and then, by default, Israel's.
I mean, that's not Iran's objective. Iran's objective is to defend its sovereignty against an existential war that was imposed on the country in the midst of negotiations. For those who are concerned about international law, if there is anything left from that, or if there is any concern left within the international community over the international law, attacking the country while it's engaged in talks with you without any actual threats being perceived is a violation of international law and humanity. And several, even U.S. officials, including Joe Kent, now resigned head of counterterrorism office of U.S. military, have said on several occasions that Iran was not pursuing to develop nuclear weapons. This has been verified several times, and as I said, even U.S. officials have said that. It does not sound like the Trump administration has any clear objective. They started by saying that the objective was to, to overthrow the regime. But then when that failed, they started saying that it's about Iran's nuclear program. And then now it's about opening the Strait of Hormuz, which was open before the war, as we said. And this is exactly what a lot of people inside Washington have also warned Trump. There is no objective. You're just ruining your own political career. I don't think Trump needs anyone to help him in ruining his political career. He has officially become a co-president together with Netanyahu, ruling over U.S. regime. And it's a question how much power he does have within the U.S. regime and who exactly is making the political decisions in Washington. So I think he himself is totally capable of ruining his capability and his presidency.
Okay, Dr. Hellyer, I know you disagree there, but let me come back to Hossein quickly because, President Trump's supporters actually praised specifically his negotiating style. But does it seem now that it's that style that's backfiring? He may argue against, diplomacy, but if he's alone in that approach, it doesn't really make for effective negotiations. And now, because of the economic implications of what's happened over that negotiating style, some are saying the United States is in a quagmire that's even worse than Iraq.
Yes, I agree. Let's assume he's been a successful negotiator because his business resume doesn't necessarily show that in the first place. But let's assume that. I think the root cause of this quagmire that the Americans are in, and maybe even Israelis as well, is coming from their racism. Plain racism has made them underestimate the ability of anyone who's not white to have thoughts, to have plans, strategies, resistance, and resilience. And you can very clearly see now that after assassination of the Supreme Leader Khamenei in Iran and top leaders, not just in this war, but even in the previous war, they were expecting the Iranian government and the regime all together collapse in 3-4 days, the way Saddam Hussein, for example, collapsed after a couple of weeks in Iraq. And I think they were planning this operation to be very similar to the Desert Fox in '98 in Iraq, where they completely degraded Iraq's military security and military and security infrastructure. And then they paved the way for a ground invasion a few years later after 9/11. So this has probably been their plan, and maybe this is becoming their plan, actually, because they thought the regime would fall very quickly after a few days, and this didn't happen. And now with the economic outcome accumulating, and not just on the US, from all the shortcomings, I think the helium shortcomings is damaging the American AI industry more than other petrochemical products. But the whole world is paying a price for this illegal war.
Final thought from you, Dr. Hellyer, because as per what Hossein was saying, how low will economic growth have to go before a collapse sets in and the social discord can actually take hold, as many are really forecasting, because we're seeing the discontent even now in countries that had no choice in any of this?
So Washington's policy establishment simply isn't functioning in the same way as it was under, frankly, any other presidency, including Trump 1. I think that if it was, then we would have not seen the United States go to war against Iran in this fashion at all, because they would have foreseen that, for example, the regime would not be toppled as the result of decapitation. I'm not sure if I accept the racism point on this particular issue, but that's another discussion. I think it was a complete misassessment of what type of regime we're talking about, but also that the Strait of Hormuz would be closed, because you've seen that predicted in many different war games over the years. But I raise this point because I think that, unfortunately, the administration is behaving very erratically, not as the result of some grand design, precisely because they don't have the same sort of policy establishment as they used to, which would have brought in different types of expertise, different types of agendas too. I'm not saying that this is all good news, but that when you have such an erratic decision-making process that's really centered around very few people, like maybe 5 people, that it means that they can go this way or go that way, extend ceasefires, declare this is happening and that is happening when it's not happening. It becomes a lot easier. Okay. So I'm not sure that it's about social discord in the United States or anything like that, as much as it will be the erratic nature of what now is being passed off as a policy-making establishment.
In the United States or in many other countries around the world, we'll have to see how that equation develops. But unfortunately, that will have to be the last word for this edition of the Newsmakers. We are completely out of time, so I'd like to thank all 3 of my panelists so much for being with us. Our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.